Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a Bradford delivery driver, operating a company vehicle in Ontario, notices that their rear indicator light has stopped functioning mid-route. The driver is under pressure to complete a time-sensitive delivery within the next hour. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Attempt to complete the delivery as quickly as possible by driving more slowly and carefully. Option B. Continue the delivery route cautiously, hoping other drivers will notice the lack of signaling. Option C. Ignore the malfunctioning indicator light and proceed with the delivery as planned, reporting it upon return. Option D. Immediately pull over to a safe location to assess the situation and arrange for repair or assistance. The correct answer is D. Immediately pull over to a safe location to assess the situation and arrange for repair or assistance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the driver to balance the immediate need to complete a delivery with the paramount responsibility of ensuring road safety and compliance with traffic regulations in Ontario. The pressure of a deadline can lead to impulsive decisions that compromise safety and legal obligations. Careful judgment is required to prioritize adherence to the law and the safety of all road users over the expediency of the delivery. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately pulling over to a safe location when experiencing a vehicle malfunction that could compromise safety. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the immediate safety risk posed by the malfunctioning indicator light. Section 144 of the Ontario Highway Traffic Act mandates that drivers must ensure their vehicle is in a safe operating condition before and during operation. A malfunctioning indicator light can lead to confusion for other drivers, increasing the risk of collisions, particularly at intersections or during lane changes. By stopping safely, the driver can assess the situation, attempt a minor fix if possible, or arrange for appropriate assistance, thereby upholding their legal and ethical duty of care. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to address the malfunctioning indicator light and continuing the journey, even with the intention of reporting it later, is a regulatory failure. This violates the requirement to maintain a vehicle in a safe operating condition as per the Ontario Highway Traffic Act. It creates an immediate hazard for other road users who may not anticipate the driver's intended maneuvers. Attempting to complete the delivery quickly by driving cautiously, but without stopping to address the indicator light, is also a regulatory failure. The intention might be to minimize delay. The underlying issue of an unsafe vehicle condition persists. The Highway Traffic Act does not provide exceptions for continuing to drive with known safety defects, regardless of caution. Ignoring the malfunctioning indicator light and hoping other drivers will notice the lack of signaling is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This approach demonstrates a disregard for the safety of others and a clear violation of traffic laws. It places an undue burden on other drivers to anticipate the driver's actions, which is contrary to the principles of predictable and safe driving. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and legal compliance above all else. When a vehicle malfunction is detected that could compromise safety, the immediate step should be to find a safe place to stop and assess the situation. This involves understanding the potential risks associated with the specific malfunction, consulting relevant regulations like the Ontario Highway Traffic Act, and making a judgment call based on whether the vehicle can be operated safely. If not, the professional course of action is to cease operation and seek assistance, even if it causes a delay. This proactive approach protects the driver, other road users, and the company from potential accidents, legal penalties, and reputational damage. Question 2. The control framework reveals that the recent implementation of new financial services regulations in Ontario has been met with challenges in ensuring all relevant personnel have fully grasped the implications for their daily operations. Which of the following represents the most effective and compliant approach to address this implementation gap? Option A. Prioritize immediate operational demands and allow employees to begin performing tasks under the new regulations, with the understanding that any compliance issues will be addressed retrospectively. Option B. Rely on a single, generic online training module that all employees must complete, assuming this covers all necessary aspects of the new regulations. Option C. Distribute the new regulatory guidelines to all staff via email and consider the training complete upon confirmation of receipt. Option D. Implement a multi-stage verification process that includes knowledge assessments and practical scenario evaluations to confirm employee understanding and application of the new regulations, alongside distribution of training materials. The correct answer is D. Implement a multi-stage verification process that includes knowledge assessments and practical scenario evaluations to confirm employee understanding and application of the new regulations, alongside distribution of training materials. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common implementation challenge in ensuring that all relevant personnel are adequately trained on new regulatory requirements. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing operational efficiency with the absolute necessity of regulatory compliance. A failure to train can lead to significant breaches, fines, and reputational damage. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and addressing the gap between the documented training and its actual effectiveness and reach within the organization. The best approach involves a proactive and multifaceted verification process. This includes not only confirming that training materials have been distributed, but also implementing mechanisms to assess comprehension and application of the new regulations. This might involve knowledge checks, practical scenario-based assessments, or supervisor sign-offs confirming employee understanding. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement for competent staff and demonstrates due diligence by the firm. In Ontario, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, FSRA, expects firms to have robust training programs that ensure employees understand and adhere to relevant legislation, such as the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario Act, 2016, and its associated regulations. A comprehensive verification process aligns with FSRA mandate to protect consumers and maintain market integrity by ensuring that individuals are knowledgeable and capable of performing their duties ethically and legally. An approach that relies solely on the distribution of training materials without any form of verification is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the regulatory expectation of ensuring comprehension and competence. It creates a significant risk of non-compliance, as employees may not have understood the material or may have misinterpreted key aspects of the regulations. This directly contravenes the spirit and letter of regulatory oversight, which mandates that firms actively ensure their staff are trained and capable. Another unacceptable approach is to assume that completion of a generic online training module is sufficient, without considering the specific nuances of the new regulations or the roles of different employees. Regulations often have specific applications depending on the employee's function. A one-size-fits-all approach can leave critical knowledge gaps for certain individuals, leading to potential breaches. This demonstrates a lack of tailored due diligence and a failure to adequately address the specific risks associated with the new regulatory framework. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate operational needs over thorough training verification, perhaps by allowing staff to begin new tasks before confirming their understanding of the relevant regulations, is also professionally unsound. This creates an unacceptable level of risk. Regulatory compliance is not a secondary concern. It is fundamental to the firm's license to operate. Delaying verification for expediency can lead to immediate and serious regulatory infractions. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements for training and competence. This should be followed by designing and implementing training programs that are not only comprehensive, but also include robust verification mechanisms. Regular review and auditing of training effectiveness, coupled with a commitment to continuous improvement, are essential. When faced with implementation challenges, professionals must prioritize compliance and risk mitigation, seeking expert advice or additional resources if necessary, rather than compromising on regulatory standards. Question 3. Risk assessment procedures indicate that while driving on a Bradford street, you observe an approaching emergency vehicle with its lights and sirens activated. You are currently in the left lane, and the emergency vehicle is approaching from behind. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Speed up to try and get ahead of the emergency vehicle to clear the intersection. Option B. Immediately move to the rightmost lane without activating hazard lights to allow the emergency vehicle to pass. Option C. Activate your hazard lights, safely reduce your speed, and if it is safe to do so and the situation warrants it for safety or to facilitate passage, move to the rightmost lane. Option D. Continue driving in your current lane at the same speed, as there is no explicit instruction to pull over. Correct answer is C. Activate your hazard lights, safely reduce your speed, and if it is safe to do so and the situation warrants it for safety or to facilitate passage, move to the rightmost lane. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a driver to balance adherence to traffic laws with the immediate need to respond to a potentially urgent situation. The driver must exercise sound judgment to determine if the deviation from standard procedure is justified and if it can be done safely and legally. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the spirit of the law versus its literal application in a dynamic environment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proceeding with caution and ensuring that the deviation from the standard lane usage is conducted in a manner that does not endanger other road users or violate traffic regulations. This means activating hazard lights to alert other drivers, maintaining a safe speed, and only moving to the rightmost lane if it is safe to do so, and the situation genuinely necessitates it for safety or to allow emergency vehicles to pass. This approach prioritizes safety and compliance with the overarching principles of traffic law, which aim to prevent accidents and maintain order on the roads. The Bradford bylaws, like most traffic regulations, emphasize safe driving practices and the avoidance of unnecessary hazards. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding to the rightmost lane without activating hazard lights is a regulatory failure because it fails to adequately warn other drivers of the unusual maneuver, increasing the risk of collision. This directly contravenes the principles of defensive driving and the expectation that drivers will communicate their intentions clearly. Continuing in the standard lane and ignoring the approaching emergency vehicle represents an ethical and regulatory failure. While not explicitly stated as a requirement to pull over in all circumstances in the Bradford bylaws, obstructing an emergency vehicle is a serious offense and goes against the civic duty to facilitate the work of emergency services. Attempting to overtake the emergency vehicle to reach the destination faster is a severe regulatory violation and an extremely dangerous action that could lead to a catastrophic accident. This demonstrates a complete disregard for traffic laws and the safety of all road users. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, legality, and ethical considerations. First, assess the immediate threat and the urgency of the situation. Second, consider the relevant traffic laws and bylaws, understanding both the letter and the spirit of the regulations. Third, evaluate the potential risks and consequences of each possible action. Finally, choose the course of action that best balances safety, compliance, and the need to respond appropriately to the circumstances, always erring on the side of caution. Question 4. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a Bradford driver has been provided with a pre-planned route by the dispatch system for their next delivery. While reviewing the route, the driver notices a potential shortcut that appears to shave off a few minutes, but it involves navigating through a less familiar residential area with narrower streets. What is the most appropriate course of action for the driver to take? Option A. Proceed with the pre-planned route, cross-referencing it with any available real-time traffic updates, and only deviate if an unavoidable impediment is encountered. Option B. Contact dispatch to ask if they can take the shortcut without providing any specific details about the route's potential risks. Option C. Immediately take the perceived shortcut to save time, assuming it will be safe and efficient. Option D. Ignore the pre-planned route and use the shortcut, as personal judgment of the quickest route is paramount. Correct answer is A. Proceed with the pre-planned route, cross-referencing it with any available real-time traffic updates, and only deviate if an unavoidable impediment is encountered. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a Bradford driver to balance the immediate need for efficient route planning with the paramount importance of adhering to safety regulations and the specific operational guidelines of their employer. The temptation to deviate from established procedures for perceived time savings can lead to significant risks, including accidents, regulatory noncompliance, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to prioritize safety and compliance over expediency. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously reviewing the route provided by the dispatch system, cross-referencing it with any available real-time traffic updates or known road closures, and then proceeding with the route as planned unless a significant, unavoidable impediment is encountered. This approach is correct because it demonstrates adherence to the Bradford driver's test's emphasis on following established procedures and prioritizing safety. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing commercial driving in the UK, mandate that drivers operate vehicles in a manner that minimizes risk and complies with all traffic laws and employer directives. Ethically, this approach upholds the driver's responsibility to their employer and the public by ensuring a safe and predictable operation. Incorrect approach is analysis. Deviating from the planned route solely based on a personal belief that a shortcut exists without verifying its safety or legality is a regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses the established risk assessment and route planning protocols designed to ensure safety and efficiency. Accepting a passenger's suggestion to take an unverified route, even if it appears shorter, introduces an unknown variable and potential hazard, violating the driver's duty of care and employer's operational guidelines. Ignoring a known road closure and proceeding with the original route, hoping to get through, is a direct contravention of traffic laws and safety regulations, creating an unacceptable risk of accident and legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and compliance above all else. This involves 1. Understanding and internalizing all employer policies and regulatory requirements. 2. Actively seeking and utilizing all available information, e.g., dispatch systems, real-time traffic data for route planning. 3. Exercising critical judgment when faced with unexpected situations, always erring on the side of caution and seeking clarification or approval if unsure. 4. Recognizing that perceived time savings are never worth compromising safety or regulatory adherence. Question 5. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported incidents related to driver fatigue among commercial vehicle operators in Ontario. A driver, whose performance has recently dipped, admits to feeling very tired, but insists they can still complete their current route. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the transportation company to take, adhering to Ontario's regulatory framework? Option A. Advise the driver to take a short break and then continue their route, emphasizing the need to meet delivery deadlines. Option B. Allow the driver to complete their current route with a verbal warning about the importance of rest. Option C. Document the driver's admission of fatigue and monitor their performance for the remainder of the route. Option D. Immediately remove the driver from service and initiate a formal investigation into the circumstances of their fatigue. The correct answer is D. Immediately remove the driver from service and initiate a formal investigation into the circumstances of their fatigue. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the number of reported incidents related to driver fatigue among commercial vehicle operators in Ontario. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a proactive and responsible approach to safety, balancing operational efficiency with the paramount duty to prevent accidents. The driver's admission of feeling tired, coupled with the observed performance dip, necessitates immediate and decisive action to uphold the safety standards mandated by Ontario's Highway Traffic Act and relevant Ministry of Transportation regulations. The best approach involves immediately removing the driver from service and initiating a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding their fatigue. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and the employer's responsibility to ensure their drivers are fit for duty. Ontario's Occupational Health and Safety Act places a general duty on employers to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. In the context of commercial driving, fatigue is a recognized hazard, and failing to address it promptly can lead to serious consequences, including regulatory penalties and civil liability. This approach prioritizes the safety of the driver, other road users, and the public, which is the fundamental ethical and legal obligation. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the driver's concerns and allow them to continue operating their vehicle, perhaps with a warning. This fails to adequately address the immediate safety risk and demonstrates a disregard for the potential consequences of fatigue driving, which is a direct violation of the employer's duty of care under Ontario law. Another incorrect approach would be to simply document the incident without taking any immediate action to assess the driver's fitness for duty. This passive response does not fulfill the employer's obligation to proactively manage safety risks and could be interpreted as negligence if an incident were to occur. Finally, An approach that focuses solely on the potential impact on delivery schedules without adequately addressing the safety concerns would be ethically and legally unacceptable, as it prioritizes commercial interests over human safety. Professionals should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves identifying potential hazards, driver fatigue, assessing the severity and likelihood of harm, and implementing control measures. In this case, the immediate control measure is to remove the driver from service. This should be followed by a thorough investigation to understand the root cause of the fatigue and to implement preventative strategies, such as reviewing scheduling, providing education on fatigue management, and ensuring compliance with hours of service regulations. Question 6. The audit findings indicate that a financial advisor in Ontario, when dealing with a long-term client who has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a single, highly speculative stock, has proceeded to execute the trade based solely on the client's instruction without further discussion or exploration of the client's overall financial goals and risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action the advisor should have taken in this situation? Option A. Advise the client that the investment is too risky and refuse to execute the trade, suggesting they seek advice elsewhere. Option B. Proceed with the trade but include a disclaimer in the client's account statement highlighting the speculative nature of the investment. Option C. Immediately execute the trade as requested by the client to demonstrate responsiveness and respect for their autonomy. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their investment preference. Assess its alignment with their overall financial objectives and risk tolerance. Explain the potential risks and rewards, and document the conversation and the client's informed decision. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their investment preference. Assess its alignment with their overall financial objectives and risk tolerance. Explain the potential risks and rewards, and document the conversation and the client's informed decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the advisor's duty to act in the client's best interest, while adhering to regulatory requirements. The advisor must navigate the potential for misinterpretation of the client's wishes and the risk of providing advice that, while technically compliant with the client's stated preference, may not be suitable or prudent given the client's overall financial situation and objectives. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client's long-term financial well-being is prioritized. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, even when the client expresses a clear preference. This means engaging in a detailed discussion to confirm the client's understanding of the implications of their request, exploring alternative strategies that might better align with their broader financial goals, and documenting the entire process, including the client's rationale for their decision and the advisor's recommendations. This aligns with the principles of client-centric advice and the regulatory obligation in Ontario to provide advice that is suitable for the client. The advisor must act with integrity and diligence, ensuring that any recommendation or action taken is in the client's best interest, which may involve educating the client on potential downsides of their preferred course of action. An incorrect approach would be to blindly follow the client's instruction without further inquiry or discussion. This fails to uphold the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and could lead to a recommendation that is not suitable, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or missing opportunities. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their motivations or explore alternatives. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could damage the professional relationship. Finally, proceeding with the client's instruction without documenting the rationale or the advisor's concerns would leave both the advisor and the client vulnerable, as it would not provide a clear record of the advice given and the client's informed consent. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and a comprehensive understanding of the client's stated needs. This should be followed by an assessment of the client's overall financial picture and objectives. If there appears to be a misalignment or potential for harm, the professional must engage in a transparent dialogue, explaining the implications of the client's request and offering suitable alternatives. The ultimate decision should be a collaborative one, with the client's informed consent, and all discussions and decisions must be meticulously documented. Question 7. The efficiency study reveals that a client in Ontario has requested urgent feedback on a proposed investment strategy, but the firm's internal compliance department has a standard 48-hour review period for all client communications. The client is a high net worth individual who expects prompt responses. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Tell the client that the firm's internal processes are slow and that they will receive feedback when it is ready, without specifying a time frame. Option B. Inform the client that the compliance review will take 48 hours and offer to provide an interim update if possible, while immediately submitting the strategy for compliance review. Option C. Bypass the compliance review to provide the client with immediate feedback, citing the client's high net worth status and expectation of prompt service. Option D. Promise the client immediate feedback within 24 hours, assuming the compliance department can expedite their review due to the client's importance. The correct answer is B. Inform the client that the compliance review will take 48 hours and offer to provide an interim update if possible, while immediately submitting the strategy for compliance review. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential conflict between the need for timely client communication and the firm's internal compliance procedures. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing client service expectations with the regulatory obligation to ensure all communications are properly reviewed and documented. A misstep could lead to regulatory breaches, client dissatisfaction, or both. The best approach involves proactively communicating with the client about the expected timeline for review and approval, while simultaneously initiating the internal review process. This demonstrates transparency with the client regarding the firm's operational constraints and regulatory requirements. It also ensures that the compliance team has adequate time to conduct a thorough review, thereby adhering to the regulatory framework governing financial advice in Ontario. This proactive communication manages client expectations and mitigates the risk of perceived delays or noncompliance. An incorrect approach would be to bypass the internal review process to expedite the client's request. This directly violates the regulatory requirement for proper oversight and documentation of client communications, exposing the firm to significant compliance risks and potential disciplinary action from the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC). Another incorrect approach is to simply inform the client that the review process will take an unspecified amount of time without providing any context or managing expectations. This fails to uphold professional standards of client service and can lead to frustration and a perception of inefficiency, even if the firm eventually complies with regulations. A further incorrect approach is to promise the client an immediate response without understanding the internal review timelines. This sets an unrealistic expectation, and if not met, can damage the client relationship and create a false impression of the firm's capabilities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance while actively managing client expectations. This involves understanding internal processes, identifying potential bottlenecks, and communicating transparently with clients about timelines and requirements. When faced with competing demands, professionals must first ensure adherence to all applicable laws and regulations, then communicate clearly and honestly with stakeholders. Question 8. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of investors in Ontario are influenced by trending investment narratives, even if these narratives do not align with their long-term financial goals or risk tolerance. An investment advisor registered with the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) is meeting with a client who has previously established a moderate risk tolerance and a long-term objective of capital preservation with modest growth. The client, having recently been exposed to a popular social media trend, now insists on allocating a substantial portion of their portfolio to a highly speculative, emerging technology sector that carries significant volatility and a high risk of capital loss. Which of the following approaches best reflects the advisor's professional and regulatory obligations under the Ontario Securities Commission framework? Option A. The advisor should subtly guide the client towards the speculative investment by highlighting only its potential upside, downplaying the risks, and suggesting it can be incorporated as a small, experimental part of the portfolio without fully disclosing the extent of its deviation from their established profile. Option B. The advisor should proceed with the client's requested allocation to the speculative sector, as the client is ultimately responsible for their investment decisions and the advisor's role is to execute client instructions. Option C. The advisor should thoroughly explain to the client the specific risks associated with the speculative investment, how it conflicts with their stated risk tolerance and long-term objectives, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their financial goals, while respecting the client's final decision after full disclosure. Option D. The advisor should refuse to discuss the speculative investment, citing the client's previously established moderate risk tolerance, and insist on sticking to the original investment plan without further discussion. The correct answer is C. The advisor should thoroughly explain to the client the specific risks associated with the speculative investment, how it conflicts with their stated risk tolerance and long-term objectives, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their financial goals, while respecting the client's final decision after full disclosure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that preference might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the client's autonomy while upholding their professional obligations under the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and comprehensively explaining to the client the risks and potential downsides of their preferred investment strategy, specifically highlighting how it deviates from a diversified, risk-appropriate portfolio aligned with their stated objectives and risk tolerance. This approach prioritizes client education and informed consent. It directly addresses the client's request while fulfilling the advisor's duty under OSC Rule 31-103 registration requirements, exemptions, and ongoing registrant obligations, which mandates that registrants must act in the best interest of their client. By detailing the potential negative consequences and offering suitable alternatives that meet their goals, the advisor empowers the client to make a truly informed decision, thereby upholding their fiduciary responsibility. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the client's request without adequate explanation or exploration of alternatives. This fails to meet the best interest of the client standard under OSC Rule 31-103. It prioritizes client appeasement over client welfare and could expose both the client and the advisor to undue risk, potentially leading to a breach of regulatory obligations and client dissatisfaction if the investment performs poorly. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright and refuse to discuss it further. While the advisor may believe the request is ill-advised, such a response can damage the client relationship and may not fully explore the client's underlying motivations or concerns. It also misses an opportunity to educate the client and guide them towards a more suitable strategy, potentially violating the spirit of client-centric advice mandated by OSC regulations. A further incorrect approach is to subtly steer the client towards the preferred investment without fully disclosing the associated risks or the existence of potentially better-suited alternatives. This lack of transparency is ethically problematic and can be seen as a violation of the duty to provide full and fair disclosure, a cornerstone of investor protection under OSC regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric approach that emphasizes open communication, thorough education, and a commitment to the client's best interests. When a client expresses a preference that appears contrary to their stated goals or risk profile, the professional's duty is to 1. Understand the client's rationale behind their preference. 2. Clearly articulate the potential risks, rewards, and implications of the preferred strategy, referencing their stated objectives and risk tolerance. 3. Propose and explain alternative strategies that are more aligned with their best interests and regulatory requirements. 4. Document the entire process, including the client's final decision and the rationale behind it, to demonstrate due diligence and compliance. Question 9. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a client in Ontario, Canada, has expressed a strong desire for aggressive growth in their investment portfolio, yet their past investment decisions and recent verbalizations indicate a significant aversion to market volatility and potential capital loss. What is the most appropriate course of action for a financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Dismiss the client's expressed concerns about risk as mere apprehension and proceed with aggressive investment recommendations based on their initial stated growth objective. Option B. Downplay the potential for losses and the impact of market volatility to encourage the client to embrace the aggressive growth strategy they initially requested. Option C. Proceed with recommending an aggressive growth portfolio as per the client's stated desire, assuming their expressed wish overrides their demonstrated behavior. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion to understand the root cause of the client's risk aversion. Use this understanding to revise their risk assessment, and then propose investment strategies that align with a risk level the client demonstrably understands and is comfortable with, even if it moderates the initial growth objective. Correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion to understand the root cause of the client's risk aversion. Use this understanding to revise their risk assessment, and then propose investment strategies that align with a risk level the client demonstrably understands and is comfortable with, even if it moderates the initial growth objective. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a financial advisor in Ontario, Canada, due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desire for aggressive growth and their demonstrable risk aversion, demonstrated through past investment behavior and expressed concerns. The advisor must navigate this discrepancy while adhering to regulatory obligations concerning suitability and client understanding, ensuring that recommendations are not only aligned with stated goals, but also with the client's actual capacity and willingness to take on risk. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the advisor's fiduciary duty to protect the client from unsuitable investments. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's true risk profile. This begins with a detailed discussion to reconcile the stated desire for aggressive growth with their observed risk aversion. The advisor should actively probe the reasons behind the client's past decisions and current anxieties, seeking to understand their emotional response to market volatility. This dialogue should then inform a revised risk assessment, potentially involving updated questionnaires and scenario planning exercises that illustrate the potential impact of aggressive strategies on their capital. Recommendations should then be tailored to a risk level that the client demonstrably understands and is comfortable with, even if it means moderating the initial growth objective. This approach is mandated by the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) under its client-focused reforms, which emphasize suitability obligations, including the requirement for registrants to have a reasonable basis to believe that a recommendation is suitable for a client based on their risk tolerance, investment objectives, financial situation, and knowledge and experience. Ethically, it upholds the principle of acting in the client's best interest. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending an aggressive growth portfolio solely based on the client's stated desire, without addressing the conflicting evidence of their risk aversion, would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This ignores the OSC's suitability requirements, as it fails to establish a reasonable basis for believing the recommendation is appropriate given the client's demonstrated risk tolerance. It also breaches the ethical duty to act in the client's best interest by potentially exposing them to undue risk. Another unacceptable approach would be to dismiss the client's expressed concerns about risk as mere apprehension, proceeding with aggressive recommendations without further investigation. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adequately assess the client's true risk profile, contravening suitability rules and ethical obligations to listen to and address client concerns. Finally, pushing the client towards aggressive investments by downplaying the potential for losses or the impact of volatility would also be professionally unacceptable. This constitutes a misrepresentation of risk and a failure to ensure the client has a full understanding of the investment, violating both regulatory disclosure requirements and ethical principles of honesty and transparency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric decision-making process that begins with active listening and thorough fact-finding. When faced with conflicting information, such as stated goals versus observed behavior, a professional's duty is to investigate and reconcile these discrepancies. This involves open dialogue, the use of appropriate assessment tools, and a commitment to ensuring the client fully understands the implications of any recommendation. The ultimate decision should be based on a comprehensive understanding of the client's circumstances, objectives, and risk tolerance, ensuring that all recommendations are demonstrably suitable and aligned with the client's best interests, as mandated by regulatory bodies like the OSC. Question 10. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for enhanced understanding of financial planning scenarios. A client in Ontario, MS, Alina Vance, invested $50,000 in a diversified portfolio 5 years ago. Today, the portfolio is valued at $75,000. MS. Vance wishes to withdraw $15,000 to cover an unexpected medical expense. Her marginal tax rate is 30%. Assuming the entire gain is considered a capital gain for tax purposes, and there are no transaction fees, what is the net amount MS. Vance will receive after accounting for potential capital gains tax, and what is the percentage of her initial investment that this net amount represents? Option A. MS. Vance will receive $15,000, which represents 30% of her initial investment. Option B. MS. Vance will receive $12,000, which represents 24% of her initial investment. Option C. MS. Vance will receive $13,500, which represents 27% of her initial investment. Option D. MS. Vance will receive $10,500, which represents 21% of her initial investment. The correct answer is C. MS. Vance will receive $13,500, which represents 27% of her initial investment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate financial needs and the long-term sustainability of their investment portfolio, particularly when market volatility is a factor. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional state and potential short-sighted decisions, while adhering to their fiduciary duty and the regulatory requirements of Ontario's securities laws. The need for precise calculations and clear communication of risk versus reward is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough quantitative analysis of the client's current portfolio performance, projected future returns under various market scenarios, and the impact of withdrawing funds on their long-term financial goals. This approach prioritizes the client's best interests by providing data-driven insights to inform their decision. Specifically, calculating the portfolio's current value, the potential capital gains tax liability on a sale, and the opportunity cost of withdrawing funds aligns with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and the Ontario Securities Commission, OSC, Rule 31-505, regarding suitability and client care. This approach ensures that the client is fully informed of the financial implications of their request, allowing for a more rational and beneficial decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately agreeing to liquidate the requested amount without a detailed financial analysis. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to ensure the client's investment strategy remains suitable and aligned with their long-term objectives. It also risks violating OSC Rule 31-505 by not adequately assessing the client's financial situation and investment needs before recommending a course of action that could be detrimental. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright due to perceived short-sightedness without exploring the underlying reasons or offering alternative solutions. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and professional judgment, potentially damaging the client relationship and failing to provide comprehensive financial advice. It overlooks the possibility that the client may have valid, albeit unarticulated, reasons for needing the funds, and the advisor's role is to help them navigate these needs within their financial plan. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the potential capital gains, tax implications, without considering the broader impact on the portfolio's growth trajectory and the client's overall financial well-being. While tax efficiency is important, it should not overshadow the primary goal of meeting the client's long-term financial objectives. This approach is incomplete and does not provide a holistic view of the consequences of the withdrawal. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's request and underlying motivations. This should be followed by a comprehensive quantitative and qualitative assessment of the situation, considering all relevant financial factors and regulatory obligations. The advisor must then communicate their findings clearly and objectively, presenting various scenarios and their implications, empowering the client to make an informed decision that best serves their interests. Question 11. The assessment process reveals a driver undergoing their G2 road test in Ontario who, after making a minor error during a lane change, becomes visibly distressed and pleads with the examiner to overlook the mistake, stating they have already failed twice and this is their last chance. The driver also mentions they are late for a crucial job interview. How should the examiner proceed? Option A. The examiner should overlook the minor lane change infraction to alleviate the driver's distress and acknowledge the importance of their job interview, as a compassionate approach is sometimes warranted. Option B. The examiner should allow the driver to repeat the lane change maneuver several times until they perform it perfectly, as this demonstrates a willingness to learn and improve. Option C. The examiner must continue the test, objectively documenting the minor lane change infraction and any subsequent driving performance, and proceed with the assessment based on the established criteria of the G2 road test. Option D. The examiner should engage in a conversation with the driver about their job interview and the reasons for their previous failures, offering encouragement and advice before continuing the test. Correct answer is C. The examiner must continue the test, objectively documenting the minor lane change infraction and any subsequent driving performance, and proceed with the assessment based on the established criteria of the G2 road test. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent conflict between a driver's desire to pass and the examiner's duty to uphold safety standards. The examiner must exercise objective judgment, resisting any pressure or attempts at manipulation, while ensuring the assessment accurately reflects the driver's competency and adherence to the Highway Traffic Act of Ontario. The correct approach involves the examiner maintaining strict impartiality and documenting all observations accurately, regardless of the driver's demeanor or expressed wishes. This aligns with the Ontario Ministry of Transportation's guidelines for driver testing, which emphasize objective evaluation based on observable driving performance and adherence to traffic laws. The examiner's role is to assess the driver's ability to operate a vehicle safely and in compliance with provincial regulations, not to accommodate personal preferences or anxieties. Ethical conduct demands that the assessment be fair, unbiased, and based solely on the criteria outlined in the testing syllabus. An incorrect approach would be to overlook a minor infraction due to the driver's expressed nervousness or their plea to pass. This compromises the integrity of the testing process and potentially places an unsafe driver on the road, violating the core principle of public safety mandated by the Highway Traffic Act of Ontario. Another incorrect approach would be to allow the driver to practice a maneuver repeatedly during the test, as this deviates from the standardized testing procedure and does not accurately assess their ability to perform the maneuver under typical driving conditions. Furthermore, engaging in a lengthy discussion about the driver's personal circumstances or reasons for needing to pass, rather than focusing on the driving task, is unprofessional and distracts from the objective assessment. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to regulations and ethical principles. This involves clearly understanding the assessment criteria, remaining objective and impartial, documenting all observations meticulously, and communicating findings clearly and professionally. When faced with pressure or unusual circumstances, the professional should refer back to the established guidelines and regulations to ensure their actions are justifiable and in the best interest of public safety. Question 12. Analysis of a scenario in Ontario where a long-standing client, known for their cautious financial habits, suddenly requests a significant withdrawal from their investment portfolio to fund a speculative venture proposed by a new acquaintance. The client appears enthusiastic, but provides vague details about the venture and the acquaintance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Advise the client to consult with their family and proceed with the withdrawal if the family approves, without conducting an independent assessment of the client's capacity or the venture's suitability. Option B. Politely decline the request, citing the speculative nature of the venture and the advisor's professional judgment that it is not in the client's best interest. Option C. Immediately process the withdrawal request as per the client's instructions, assuming the client is acting with full knowledge and autonomy. Option D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's understanding of the proposed venture, their capacity to make such a decision, and the potential risks and implications for their overall financial plan before proceeding or advising further. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's understanding of the proposed venture, their capacity to make such a decision, and the potential risks and implications for their overall financial plan before proceeding or advising further. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for harm or misjudgment. The advisor must navigate the delicate balance of respecting client autonomy while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to regulatory requirements designed to protect vulnerable individuals. The pressure to satisfy a client's immediate request, especially when it involves significant financial decisions, can cloud judgment, making a structured, evidence-based approach crucial. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough assessment of the client's capacity and understanding, coupled with a comprehensive review of their financial situation and objectives. This approach prioritizes the client's best interests by ensuring they are making informed decisions that align with their overall financial well-being and are not unduly influenced or acting under a misunderstanding. Specifically, under the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) regulations, advisors have a duty to act honestly, in good faith, and to deal fairly with clients. This includes understanding the client's financial situation, investment needs, and objectives, and providing advice that is suitable. A detailed assessment of capacity and understanding directly supports this duty by ensuring the advice given is truly suitable and that the client comprehends the implications of their decisions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the advisor's duty of care and suitability obligations under OSC regulations. It risks facilitating a transaction that is not in the client's best interest, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory sanctions for the advisor. Another incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the client's request based on a superficial assessment or personal judgment of the client's capabilities. While caution is warranted, outright refusal without a proper assessment can be seen as paternalistic and may violate the principle of treating clients fairly. The advisor must explore the reasons behind the request and assess capacity objectively. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the decision-making entirely to a family member without ensuring the client's direct involvement and understanding. While family input can be valuable, the ultimate responsibility for advice and suitability rests with the advisor and the client. This approach risks circumventing the advisor's regulatory obligations and could lead to decisions that do not reflect the client's true wishes or best interests. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's request and underlying motivations. This should be followed by a systematic assessment of the client's capacity, financial situation, and objectives, referencing relevant regulatory guidelines. G. OSC's client-focused reforms. If concerns arise regarding capacity or suitability, the advisor should engage in further dialogue, seek clarification, and potentially involve other professionals or family members in a supportive, rather than directive, capacity, always ensuring the client's informed consent and understanding remain paramount. Question 13. The review process indicates that a financial advisor in London, UK, has developed a close personal friendship with a long-standing client. The client, aware of the advisor's upcoming birthday, offers a gift of significant value, exceeding the nominal limits typically allowed by the advisor's firm for client gifts. The advisor is aware that the client is also seeking advice on a substantial investment decision. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor to take in this situation, considering the regulatory framework in the UK? Option A. Politely refuse the gift immediately, citing firm policy, without further discussion with the client about the investment or the relationship. Option B. Proceed with advising the client on the investment decision without mentioning the gift and accept it later, believing that the personal relationship is separate from professional duties. Option C. Accept the gift without disclosure, assuming the personal relationship will not influence professional judgment and that the client's intent is purely friendly. Option D. Disclose the offer of the gift to the client, explain the firm's policy on gift acceptance, and seek the client's explicit consent to accept the gift, while also discussing how the personal relationship will be managed to ensure objective advice on the investment decision. The correct answer is D. Disclose the offer of the gift to the client, explain the firm's policy on gift acceptance, and seek the client's explicit consent to accept the gift, while also discussing how the personal relationship will be managed to ensure objective advice on the investment decision. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential conflict of interest and a breach of professional conduct regarding the handling of client information and the acceptance of gifts. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining client trust, adhering to regulatory obligations, and managing personal relationships. The advisor must exercise sound judgment to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, which can erode client confidence and lead to regulatory sanctions. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's best interests and regulatory compliance above personal gain or convenience. This means proactively disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the client and seeking their informed consent before proceeding with any advice or transactions that could be influenced by the relationship. Furthermore, adhering to the firm's internal policies on gift acceptance, which likely stipulate limits and disclosure requirements, is paramount. This approach ensures transparency, upholds fiduciary duties, and aligns with the principles of ethical financial advice as mandated by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA in the UK, specifically under the Conduct of Business Sourcebook (COBS), and the Senior Management and Systems Arrangements (SISC) rules, which emphasize client protection and robust internal controls. An incorrect approach would be to accept the gift without disclosure, rationalizing that the relationship is purely personal and the gift is of nominal value. This fails to acknowledge the potential for perceived or actual influence on professional advice, thereby violating the FCA's principles of integrity and acting with due skill, care, and diligence. It also likely contravenes internal firm policies on gift acceptance, which are designed to prevent such conflicts. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with advising the client on the investment without any disclosure, assuming the personal relationship will not impact professional judgment. This is ethically unsound and regulatorily problematic, as it creates an undisclosed conflict of interest. The FCA's rules require firms to manage conflicts of interest effectively, and failing to disclose a significant personal relationship that could influence advice is a direct breach of this requirement. A further incorrect approach would be to immediately reject the gift outright without considering the client's intent or the firm's policy. While seemingly cautious, this could unnecessarily damage the personal relationship and might not be the most nuanced or appropriate response if the gift, within policy limits, could be accepted with proper disclosure and client consent. The focus should be on managing the conflict transparently, not necessarily on a blanket refusal that could be perceived as overly rigid or dismissive. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This involves a thorough understanding of regulatory requirements, e.g., FCA rules on conflicts of interest in gift acceptance, and internal firm policies. The next step is to assess the materiality of the conflict and its potential impact on client interests. If a conflict exists, the professional must then consider all available options for managing it, prioritizing transparency, client consent, and adherence to regulatory and ethical standards. This often involves disclosure, seeking client agreement, or, in some cases, recusal from providing advice. Question 14. Performance analysis shows that a client in Ontario who has previously expressed a desire for conservative growth and a low tolerance for risk is now requesting to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative technology startup that has no track record and is not publicly traded. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Refuse to discuss the speculative investment with the client, stating that it is outside the scope of acceptable investments for their portfolio. Option B. Execute the client's requested investment immediately, as the client's instructions are paramount and the advisor's role is to fulfill them. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, clearly outlining the risks associated with speculative investments, explaining how this specific investment conflicts with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and proposing alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their objectives. Option D. Override the client's request and unilaterally select a different, more conservative investment for the client without further consultation. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, clearly outlining the risks associated with speculative investments, explaining how this specific investment conflicts with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and proposing alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their objectives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that preference might lead to suboptimal outcomes or expose the client to undue risk. The advisor must navigate the client's autonomy while upholding regulatory obligations and ethical principles. The specific context of Ontario's regulatory framework for financial advisors adds a layer of complexity, requiring adherence to rules designed to protect consumers. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, documented discussion with the client about the risks and benefits of their preferred investment strategy, clearly explaining why it may not align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance. This approach prioritizes client education and informed consent. Under Ontario's regulatory framework, specifically the Ontario Securities Commission, OSC, rules and the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada, IIROC, rules, if applicable to the advisor's registration, advisors have a duty to understand their client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge and experience. When a client's request conflicts with these fundamental suitability requirements, the advisor must explain the discrepancy and recommend an alternative that is suitable. Documenting this discussion is crucial for demonstrating compliance and fulfilling the duty of care. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the client's preferred investment without further inquiry or explanation fails to meet the advisor's suitability obligations. This approach ignores the regulatory requirement to assess and act in the client's best interest, potentially exposing the client to unsuitable risk or investments that do not align with their goals. Proceeding with the client's request solely based on their instruction, without addressing the potential mismatch with their stated objectives, constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach is to refuse to discuss the client's preferred investment altogether. This can be perceived as dismissive of the client's wishes and may damage the advisor-client relationship. While the advisor has a duty to ensure suitability, a complete refusal to engage in discussion about a client's expressed interest is not the most professional or effective way to manage the situation. The regulatory expectation is for dialogue and education, not outright dismissal. Finally, immediately overriding the client's preference and unilaterally selecting a different investment without a clear, documented explanation and client agreement is also problematic. While the advisor may believe they know best, this approach bypasses the client's right to make informed decisions and can undermine trust. The process should be collaborative, with the advisor guiding the client towards suitable choices through education and reasoned recommendations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and preferences. This is followed by an objective assessment against regulatory requirements and the advisor's professional judgment regarding suitability, risk, and alignment with stated goals. When a discrepancy arises, the professional's duty is to engage in transparent communication, educate the client on the implications of their preferences, and collaboratively develop a plan that meets both regulatory standards and the client's best interests. Documentation of all discussions and decisions is paramount. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a long-standing client in Ontario, who has always been meticulous with their investments, has suddenly requested a significant withdrawal from their portfolio to invest in a speculative venture that has been heavily promoted on social media. The client expresses strong conviction in this venture, stating they just have a feeling it will be a major success, and are insistent on proceeding immediately. The advisor has concerns about the volatility and unproven nature of this investment, as well as the client's sudden shift in investment philosophy. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in Ontario? Option A. Advise the client that this type of investment is too risky and refuse to process the withdrawal, suggesting they seek advice elsewhere if they are determined to proceed. Option B. Proceed with the withdrawal and investment, but make a note in the client's file that the advisor had reservations about the suitability of the investment. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the source of their conviction, explain the risks associated with speculative investments and the specific venture, assess the client's understanding of these risks, and document the entire conversation, including the client's final decision and the advisor's recommendations. Option D. Immediately process the withdrawal request as per the client's instructions, as the client is of legal age and has the right to direct their own investments. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the source of their conviction. Explain the risks associated with speculative investments and the specific venture. Assess the client's understanding of these risks, and document the entire conversation, including the client's final decision and the advisor's recommendations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for harm or misinterpretation of those wishes, particularly when dealing with sensitive personal information and financial decisions. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance while adhering strictly to their professional and regulatory obligations in Ontario, Canada. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented process of understanding the client's intent, assessing their capacity, and ensuring any actions taken are in their best interest and legally sound. This includes clearly documenting all discussions, the client's stated instructions, the advisor's assessment of the situation, and the rationale for any proposed or executed actions. This aligns with the fiduciary duty owed to clients, which requires acting with utmost good faith, loyalty, and care. In Ontario, financial advisors are bound by provincial securities legislation and industry-specific codes of conduct e.g., those of the Mutual Fund Dealers Association of Canada or the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada, depending on registration, that mandate client-centric advice, suitability assessments, and robust record-keeping. The advisor's responsibility is not merely to follow instructions blindly, but to ensure those instructions are informed, understood, and ultimately beneficial to the client, or to respectfully decline if they are not. An incorrect approach would be to immediately execute the client's request without further inquiry. This fails to uphold the advisor's duty of care and suitability obligations. The advisor would be acting on potentially incomplete or misunderstood information, which could lead to detrimental financial outcomes for the client. This bypasses the critical step of verifying the client's understanding and capacity, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or making decisions that are not aligned with their overall financial well-being. Such an action could be seen as a breach of regulatory requirements for client protection and suitability. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying motivation or to explore alternatives. While the advisor may have concerns, a complete refusal without discussion or exploration of the client's reasoning can damage the client relationship and fail to address the client's needs, even if those needs are not immediately apparent or are poorly articulated. This approach lacks the necessary diligence and client engagement expected under Ontario's regulatory framework, which emphasizes communication and understanding. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request, but to fail to document the process adequately. Even if the advisor believes they are acting in the client's best interest, a lack of thorough documentation leaves both the advisor and the client vulnerable. It prevents a clear audit trail of the decision-making process, making it difficult to demonstrate compliance with regulations or to defend actions if challenged. Proper record-keeping is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance in Ontario, ensuring transparency and accountability. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Active listening and clarification. Ensure full understanding of the client's request and the reasons behind it. 2. Capacity assessment. Evaluate the client's ability to understand the implications of their request. 3. Risk/benefit analysis. Assess the potential positive and negative consequences of fulfilling the request. 4. Regulatory compliance check. Determine if the request aligns with all applicable laws and industry standards in Ontario. 5. Documentation. Meticulously record all discussions, assessments, and decisions. 6. Professional judgment. Apply expertise and ethical principles to guide the decision, seeking advice if necessary. Question 16. Investigation of a learner driver during their Bradford driver's test reveals they are about to attempt a maneuver that, due to their current positioning and speed, is demonstrably unsafe and likely to cause a serious driving fault or immediate danger to other road users. The learner appears flustered but insists on proceeding. What is the most appropriate course of action for the accompanying instructor? Option A. Continue the test as planned, ignoring the learner's distress and the potential for an unsafe maneuver. Option B. Immediately terminate the test and report the learner for unsafe driving without further interaction. Option C. Intervene immediately to prevent the unsafe maneuver and ensure the safety of all involved. Option D. Allow the learner to proceed with the maneuver, trusting they will correct themselves or that the examiner will note the error. The correct answer is C. Intervene immediately to prevent the unsafe maneuver and ensure the safety of all involved. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for harm or misjudgment. The driver's instructor must balance their duty of care to the learner with the need to uphold the standards and integrity of the Bradford driver's test. The instructor's role is not merely to facilitate a pass, but to ensure the learner is a safe and competent driver, adhering to the specific regulations of the UK driving test. This requires careful judgment to identify situations where a learner's actions, even if seemingly minor, could indicate a deeper issue affecting road safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the instructor intervening to prevent the learner from proceeding with a maneuver that is clearly unsafe and likely to result in a serious driving fault or danger. This approach prioritizes road safety and adherence to the DVSA, Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, guidelines for the practical driving test. The instructor's primary responsibility is to ensure the safety of the learner, the examiner, and other road users. Allowing a demonstrably unsafe maneuver to continue, even if the learner insists, would be a dereliction of this duty and would undermine the purpose of the test, which is to certify competence. The instructor must act decisively to prevent potential harm or a significant breach of driving regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves allowing the learner to proceed with the maneuver despite recognizing its inherent danger. This fails to uphold the instructor's duty of care and the safety standards mandated by the DVSA. It could lead to an accident or a severe driving fault, compromising the integrity of the test and potentially putting others at risk. Another incorrect approach is to immediately terminate the test and report the learner for unsafe driving without attempting to guide them or understand the root cause of their hesitation or confusion. While safety is paramount, a skilled instructor should first attempt to correct minor errors or provide clarification where possible, unless the situation is immediately and unequivocally dangerous. This approach might be overly punitive and fail to address potential learning gaps. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the learner's distress and proceed with the test as if nothing is wrong, hoping they will correct themselves. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and a failure to recognize signs of learner incompetence or potential danger. It neglects the instructor's responsibility to actively manage the learning environment and ensure the test is conducted safely and fairly. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. First, assess the immediate risk to safety. If the risk is high, immediate intervention is necessary. Second, consider the learner's competency and the specific requirements of the Bradford driver's test and DVSA guidelines. Third, evaluate the potential consequences of intervention versus non-intervention. The goal is to act in a manner that is both safe and ethically sound, upholding professional standards and the regulatory framework. Question 17. Comparative studies suggest that client preferences can sometimes diverge from optimal investment strategies. In Ontario, Canada, an investment advisor is working with a client who has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative emerging market technology stock. The advisor has reviewed the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and stated long-term goals, and believes this investment is not suitable and carries an unacceptably high risk of capital loss, which is inconsistent with the client's overall financial plan. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Execute the trade as requested by the client, but make a note in the client's file that the investment was made against the advisor's recommendation. Option B. Advise the client that the investment is too risky and refuse to execute the trade, without offering further explanation or alternatives. Option C. Proceed with the client's preferred investment in the speculative stock to maintain client satisfaction, assuming the client understands the inherent risks. Option D. Clearly explain to the client the specific risks associated with the speculative stock, detailing potential downsides and the likelihood of capital loss, while also presenting alternative investment options that align better with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and documenting this discussion thoroughly. The correct answer is D. Clearly explain to the client the specific risks associated with the speculative stock, detailing potential downsides and the likelihood of capital loss, while also presenting alternative investment options that align better with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and documenting this discussion thoroughly. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when the client's preference may lead to suboptimal outcomes or expose them to undue risk. The advisor must navigate this by prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical obligations over immediate client satisfaction, requiring careful judgment and clear communication. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly explaining the risks and potential downsides of the client's preferred investment strategy, providing clear, objective information about alternative options that better align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance. This approach is correct because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty, as mandated by the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) regulation, which require advisors to act honestly, in good faith, and with a view to the best interests of the client. It also aligns with the ethical principles of transparency and informed consent, ensuring the client makes decisions based on a complete understanding of the implications. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the client's preferred strategy without a detailed explanation of its risks and alternatives fails to meet the advisor's fiduciary duty and the OSC's requirement for suitability. This approach prioritizes client preference over client well-being, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory breaches. Agreeing to the client's request solely to maintain the relationship, without addressing the underlying suitability issues, is also a failure to act in the client's best interest and could be seen as facilitating a potentially unsuitable investment. Proceeding with the client's request without documenting the discussion and the client's informed decision is a significant regulatory failure, as proper record-keeping is essential for demonstrating compliance and accountability under OSC rules. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated goals and risk tolerance. This is followed by an objective assessment of investment suitability based on regulatory requirements and ethical principles. If a client's preference conflicts with suitability, the professional must engage in a transparent and educational dialogue, clearly outlining risks, benefits, and alternatives. The decision should be documented, reflecting the client's informed choice after receiving comprehensive advice. Question 18. The investigation demonstrates that a financial advisor in Ontario, Canada, has a long-standing client who recently inherited a substantial sum. This client has consistently expressed a preference for capital preservation and has a documented history of conservative investment choices. However, the client has recently become acquainted with an individual who is strongly advocating for a significant investment in a highly speculative cryptocurrency. The client, while acknowledging their usual cautious approach, is expressing interest in this new opportunity. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to thoroughly assess the suitability of the cryptocurrency investment, clearly outlining its speculative nature, potential for loss, and how it aligns or conflicts with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and document this conversation comprehensively. Option B. Advise the client that due to their history of conservative investing, this type of investment is not appropriate and refuse to facilitate the transaction without further discussion. Option C. Proceed with facilitating the cryptocurrency investment as requested by the client, assuming the client is making an informed decision based on their newfound interest. Option D. Recommend the cryptocurrency investment to the client, emphasizing the potential for high returns, without dwelling on the associated risks, given the client's expressed interest. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to thoroughly assess the suitability of the cryptocurrency investment, clearly outlining its speculative nature, potential for loss, and how it aligns or conflicts with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and document this conversation comprehensively. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a financial advisor, operating within Ontario, Canada, is approached by a long-term client with a significant inheritance. The client, who has a history of conservative investment choices and expresses a desire for capital preservation, is being heavily influenced by a new acquaintance to invest in a high-risk, speculative cryptocurrency venture. This situation is professionally challenging because it pits the advisor's fiduciary duty and professional ethics against the client's expressed wishes, the potential for undue influence, and the inherent risks of the proposed investment. The advisor must navigate the client's autonomy while ensuring they understand the risks and are not acting on impulse or misinformation. The best professional approach involves a thorough, documented discussion with the client about the proposed investment, focusing on risk assessment and suitability. This includes clearly outlining the speculative nature of the cryptocurrency, the potential for substantial loss, and how it conflicts with the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance. The advisor should also inquire about the source of the recommendation and the client's understanding of the investment's mechanics. This approach aligns with the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) regulations, particularly those concerning Know Your Client (KIC) rules and suitability obligations. Advisors are mandated to understand their client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments before making recommendations or facilitating transactions. Documenting this discussion is crucial for demonstrating compliance and protecting both the client and the advisor. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without adequately assessing suitability or documenting the discussion. This fails to uphold the advisor's duty to act in the client's best interest, as mandated by OSC regulations. Facilitating a high-risk investment that contradicts a client's stated conservative objectives and risk tolerance, especially when there's a suggestion of external influence, is a direct violation of suitability requirements. Another incorrect approach would be to outright refuse the client's request without a comprehensive discussion and explanation. While the advisor has a duty to ensure suitability, dismissing a client's wishes without attempting to educate them or understand their motivations can damage the client relationship and may not fully address potential undue influence. The advisor should aim to guide the client towards informed decisions, not simply block them. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to recommend the investment based solely on the client's expressed interest, without conducting an independent suitability assessment or highlighting the significant risks. This would be a dereliction of the advisor's professional responsibility and a breach of OSC regulations, potentially exposing the client to unacceptable financial harm. The professional reasoning process for such situations should involve a structured approach. First, actively listen to the client's request and underlying motivations. Second, assess the proposed investment against the client's established profile, KYC information, risk tolerance, financial goals. Third, clearly communicate the risks and benefits of the proposed investment, particularly in relation to the client's profile. Fourth, document all discussions, advice given, and the client's decisions. If a proposed investment is deemed unsuitable, the advisor must clearly explain why and offer suitable alternatives. Question 19. Assessment of a financial advisor's conduct in Ontario. A client who is nearing retirement has requested to liquidate a significant portion of their investment portfolio to purchase a speculative, high-risk cryptocurrency, citing a desire for rapid wealth accumulation. The advisor has concerns that this request is not suitable for the client's risk tolerance, financial goals, and the regulatory guidelines set forth by the Ontario Securities Commission. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their request, explain the potential risks and regulatory implications of investing in speculative cryptocurrencies, and explore alternative investment strategies that align with their retirement objectives and risk profile. Option B. Immediately execute the client's request to liquidate the portfolio and purchase the cryptocurrency, as the client has the ultimate authority over their investments. Option C. Refuse the client's request outright and inform them that the advisor will not facilitate such a transaction due to its speculative nature. Option D. Proceed with the liquidation and purchase, but downplay the associated risks to the client to avoid causing them undue stress. The correct answer is A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their request, explain the potential risks and regulatory implications of investing in speculative cryptocurrencies, and explore alternative investment strategies that align with their retirement objectives and risk profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to an outcome that is not in their best interest or may violate regulatory principles. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring compliance while upholding their duty of care and acting with integrity. The pressure to satisfy a client's immediate demand, even if ill-advised, requires careful judgment and a robust understanding of their obligations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and empathetic discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their request. This approach prioritizes client education and aims to guide them towards a decision that aligns with their long-term financial well-being and regulatory requirements. By explaining the potential negative consequences of their initial request, such as increased tax liabilities or a breach of investment suitability rules under the Ontario Securities Commission (OSC) regulations, the advisor fulfills their fiduciary duty. This proactive engagement ensures the client is fully informed and can make a more considered decision, thereby maintaining trust and adhering to the OSC's mandate for investor protection. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately executing the client's request without further discussion. This fails to meet the advisor's obligation to act in the client's best interest and to provide suitable advice as mandated by the OSC. It prioritizes client satisfaction over responsible guidance and could lead to detrimental financial outcomes for the client, potentially exposing the advisor to regulatory scrutiny for failing to conduct proper due diligence and suitability assessments. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright and refuse to consider any alternatives. While the initial request may be problematic, a complete refusal without exploring the client's motivations or offering alternative solutions demonstrates a lack of client centricity and professional engagement. This can damage the client relationship and may not address the client's underlying financial needs or concerns, potentially leading them to seek advice elsewhere from less scrupulous individuals. A further incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's request while downplaying the associated risks. This is ethically unsound and violates the principle of full disclosure required by the OSC. Minimizing potential negative consequences, such as future tax implications or the unsuitability of the investment for the client's risk profile, constitutes a misrepresentation and erodes the foundation of trust essential in the advisor-client relationship. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centered approach that balances client autonomy with their duty of care and regulatory obligations. This involves active listening to understand the client's goals, transparently explaining the implications of their requests, and collaboratively exploring suitable alternatives. When faced with a client's potentially detrimental request, the decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the why behind the request. 2. Assessing the request against regulatory requirements, e.g., OSC suitability rules. 3. Clearly articulating the risks and benefits of the proposed action and alternatives. And 4. Documenting all discussions and decisions thoroughly. Question 20. Compliance review shows that a client in London, UK, has expressed a strong interest in trading contracts for difference, CFD, due to their potential for high returns. The client has a liquid net worth of £50,000, an annual income of £70,000, and monthly expenses of £3,000. They are willing to risk up to 10% of their liquid net worth on this specific investment. The proposed CFD trade involves an underlying asset with a current price of £100 per unit, and the client intends to invest £5,000 as initial margin for 50 units. The broker's leverage is 10:1. In a worst-case scenario, the underlying asset price could drop by 20% within a single trading day. What is the maximum potential loss for the client in this worst-case scenario, and is the proposed trade suitable based on their stated risk tolerance? Option A. The maximum potential loss is £10,000, which exceeds the client's stated risk tolerance of £5,000, 10% of £50,000, making the trade unsuitable. Option B. The maximum potential loss is £5,000, which is within the client's stated risk tolerance of £5,000, making the trade suitable. Option C. The maximum potential loss is £15,000, which exceeds the client's stated risk tolerance of £5,000, making the trade unsuitable. Option D. The maximum potential loss is £10,000, which is within the client's stated risk tolerance of £5,000, making the trade suitable. The correct answer is A. The maximum potential loss is £10,000, 000, which exceed the client's stated risk tolerance of £5, 000, 10% of £50, 000, making the trade unsuitable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory where a client's investment goals, risk tolerance, and financial capacity must be meticulously aligned with suitable investment products. The professional's duty is to act in the client's best interest, which requires a thorough understanding of both the client's circumstances and the characteristics of the investment. Misjudging the suitability of an investment, especially one involving leverage and potential for amplified losses, can lead to significant financial harm for the client and regulatory repercussions for the advisor. The mathematical component adds a layer of complexity, requiring the advisor to not only understand the qualitative aspects of suitability, but also the quantitative implications of the investment's performance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, including their income, expenses, assets, liabilities, and investment objectives. This assessment must then be used to determine the client's capacity to absorb potential losses, particularly in the context of a leveraged product like a CFD. Calculating the potential downside risk, as demonstrated by the worst-case scenario calculation, is crucial. If the potential loss exceeds a reasonable percentage of the client's liquid net worth or their stated risk tolerance, the product is unsuitable. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core principles of client-centric advice mandated by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, specifically the requirements under the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, MiFID Roman II, and the FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, which emphasize suitability and acting in the client's best interests. The mathematical calculation provides objective evidence to support the suitability assessment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves recommending the CFD without a detailed calculation of the potential loss relative to the client's financial capacity. This fails to adequately assess the client's ability to bear losses, a fundamental requirement for suitability. It prioritizes the client's stated interest in high returns over their actual capacity to withstand the associated risks, potentially violating FCA principles of treating customers fairly. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the recommendation based solely on the client's expressed desire for high returns, ignoring the inherent risks of leveraged products and the need for a quantitative assessment of downside risk. This approach is ethically flawed as it exploits the client's potential lack of understanding of complex financial instruments and their associated risks, leading to a breach of the duty of care. A further incorrect approach would be to recommend the CFD without considering the client's overall financial picture, focusing only on the initial margin requirement. This is a superficial assessment that overlooks the potential for margin calls and losses far exceeding the initial investment, which is a critical failure in risk assessment and suitability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's financial profile and objectives. This should be followed by a detailed analysis of any proposed investment, including its risks, potential rewards, and costs. For complex products like CFDs, a quantitative assessment of potential losses, using scenarios like the one presented, is essential. This assessment must be benchmarked against the client's capacity to absorb such losses without jeopardizing their financial well-being. If the investment is deemed unsuitable, the professional must clearly explain why to the client and offer alternative, more appropriate solutions. This process ensures compliance with regulatory requirements and upholds the ethical obligation to act in the client's best interests.